On August 6, 1945, just after midnight, a B-29 bomber christened the Enola Gay departed Tinian Island, carrying the crew of Special Bombing Mission Number 13. The bomber was preceded by 3 planes, Straight Flush, Jabbit 3, and Full Schaus, each on an independent mission to assess the weather conditions of 3 Japanese cities, Kokura, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima. Today's target is Hiroshima. 2 other planes depart after the Enola Gay, both observation planes outfitted with cameras and scientific equipment. Several hours later, as the sun is beginning to rise, the pilot of the Straight Flush sends over a coded message to the Enola Gay. Cloud cover less than 3/10 at all altitudes. Advice: bomb primary. Minutes later, the all-clear is sounded, and the B-29 enters Hiroshima airspace without a single enemy fighter in the sky. On the ground, Japanese officials sound alarms for an air raid. For the people of Hiroshima, the sound has become so commonplace it's almost ignored. At 8:15 local time, Enola Gay's bomb doors snap open, and its payload, a single warhead dubbed Little Boy, drops out. The bomb falls for 6 miles and 45 seconds before reaching its intended altitude. 0.015 seconds later, a woman sitting on the banks of the Ota River, just 1/2 mile from ground zero, is instantly vaporized, as are an estimated 80,000 others. By the time the bomb has claimed its last life months and years after detonation, through the devastation of atomic radiation, some 237,000 people will be dead. At the time of the bombing, the city of Hiroshima had a population of 280,000 people. The atomic bomb was a matter of unprecedented national security. So few people knew, in fact, that President Truman would only learn of the bomb he would ultimately use when he became the president himself. This secrecy was essential to the end of the war, at least in the perspective of the United States Armed Forces. But it was that same secrecy that contributed to one of the biggest naval disasters the United States Navy would ever experience. A blight on their history so bad it took 50 years, a feature film, and a 12-year-old boy from Pensacola to finally bring some measure of justice to the hundreds who died as a result of that same secrecy. However, the same few who worked on Special Bombing Mission Number 13 and prepared both Little Boy and the Enola Gay for its world-changing mission did know about the men that the Navy failed. The hundreds who brought Little Boy to them and made their mission possible, which is why Little Boy carried a message inscribed on it as it fell down upon Hiroshima, scrawled in by a member of the assembly team. This one is for the boys of the Indianapolis. The story of the USS Indianapolis is arguably as well buried as it was intended to be. From the perspective of an outside observer, it's a horrific tragedy, a fabled story ripped right out of a horror film. So horrific, actually, that a horror film ripped this moment right out of history. But from a military perspective, the sinking was as inconvenient as a military disaster could be. It was summer of 1945, after a long, brutal, indescribably horrific World War, the second one in the minds of many at the time. The Allied powers were seeking a decisive end to that war. You probably know the story. In April of 1945, Nazi rule ended in Germany, fascist rule ended in Italy, but the East was still brewing with plenty of conflict, and there were legendary battles to be had in the East. In America, you doubtlessly know of the battles of Iwo Jima and Midway, which were as captivating as they were terrifying for the men who were there. And as America and the other Allied powers crept closer to mainland Japan, the fighting turned more brutal by each island and every inch they fought. The Japanese military turned to increasingly desperate tactics, including kamikaze planes, kite and suicide torpedoes, and, of course, the banzai charges. And it wasn't just the Japanese military, but also Japanese civilians that were growing more desperate. American soldiers passed around tales of civilians fighting with rusty rifles and entire families that had thrown themselves off of the cliffs in Okinawa. Such tales were certainly true, but the numbers were probably embellished. Nevertheless, whether or not the dropping of the atomic bomb was intended to spare all sides of a horrific, and undoubtedly it would have been a horrific, land invasion of Japan, or if it was to demonstrate raw power to the growing Soviet threat, I won't be getting into. I'm only going to get into what pertains to our story today, that of the USS Indianapolis. In the United States, the infamous Manhattan Project reached its climax in the desert scrublands just 35 miles outside of Alamogordo, New Mexico, when the first atomic explosion became a reality with the Trinity Test. Coming off the success of that test, the United States had enough nuclear material to immediately produce 2 bombs. After confirming the success of the Trinity Test, the United States was very interested in using these weapons. The USS Indianapolis was tasked with delivering the bomb. Once a state-of-the-art heavy cruiser, was now well past its prime by July of 1945, but nevertheless completed its mission and completed it in hours, not days, but hours after the Trinity Test, setting a new speed record to Pearl Harbor on its way to the island of Tinian. The Indianapolis would set sail, the essential components of what would become Little Boy, as well as half of the fissile uranium in the world, as it traveled approximately 29 knots an hour, or the non-nautical amongst us, that's 30 miles per hour. The ship arrived in Tinian and unloaded its cargo without incident, before setting sail for the Philippines, where it was expected to prepare for the coming invasion of Japan, scheduled for later that fall. Sailing unaccompanied in submarine-filled waters, the USS Indianapolis sank the very night it set sail. However, the secrecy of their mission, as well as a complex blunder of U.S. naval protocol, resulted in them not being marked absent for over 4 days. Of the nearly 1,200 men that were on board when it sunk, only a little under 900 survived that sinking, floating in the vast Pacific Ocean, waiting for a rescue, waiting for anyone at all. But as I said, over 4 days would pass before the United States would put things together, and by the time that help did come, only 317 men were saved. The rest died in terrible ways, from hypothermia to exhaustion, from the injuries they suffered during the sinking, like broken bones or burns. They died of exposure, drowning, and of course, what the sinking is really known for, thanks to Hollywood, shark attack. Picked off one by one, the white-tipped sharks of the Pacific began to take the dead and the living. The fatality estimates range from a few dozen to 150, but the number doesn't really matter in the end because it was the worst shark attack in human history, either before or since. In the immediate aftermath of this unprecedented disaster, the news was suppressed. Press who encountered the survivors were placed under military censor, and families of the men were not informed of the sinking. The censor was lifted just over a week later, the day after President Truman informed the nation that the Empire of Japan had agreed to unconditional surrender. Outrage over the Navy's blunder was minimal, as the story of the Indy's sinking was buried in the back of most newspapers behind stories of the VJ Day celebrations around the country. But about 3 months later, outrage did once again bubble to the surface, when the captain of the USS Indianapolis, Charles Butler McVeigh, was the first, and so far the only captain ever to be court-martialed for the loss of a ship as the result of enemy action. Somewhat famously, the Japanese commander who sunk his ship was called to testify before Congress, and even he agreed that the captain should have been exonerated. But nevertheless, time moves on, and very few remembered the Indianapolis, save for the families of the men on board, as well as the survivors themselves, who would hold reunions in the city of Indianapolis. Decades later, in the 1970s, a new book came out, one about a small seaside town and the great white shark that terrorized the tourists there. Even before its release in February of 1974, the entertainment industry knew that Jaws, the premiere book from the soon-to-be famous novelist Peter Benchley, was going to be a hit. Producers flocked to purchase the film rights after reading advance copies. As production got underway, they selected a relatively unknown director, a young man in his mid-20s, fresh off the success of the TV film Duel. And that's how a young Steven Spielberg directed Jaws, the highest-grossing film of all time upon its release. The adaptation from book to screen would challenge the writers of the script, who needed to trim down subplots and make the feature film more accessible and dramatic. And so they found inspiration in the tales of a shark hunter. If you've ever seen the movie, you'll doubtlessly remember the relentless and unhinged shark hunter Captain Quint. In the third act, as the men are sitting around drinking and sharing stories about their scars, Police Chief Brody asks Captain Quint about his tattoo, a tattoo of the USS Indianapolis. Quint's description of his survival of the sinking is haunting, and aside from a few issues with his numbers that he quotes, the character is otherwise dead on as he describes the horror that the men of the Indianapolis went on to suffer when they went into the sea. Now, this was probably the most attention the ship had received since it sank in 1945, but the most significant reason why the tragedy of the Indianapolis is remembered as much as it is today is not so much the result of the movie itself, but rather because of someone who watched it. In 1998, 12-year-old Hunter Scott of Pensacola, Florida, saw the film, and he asked his father about the story behind the Indianapolis. Scott was so intrigued by Quint's monologue that he went on to make the tale of the Indy the focus of his National History Day project. He went on to interview nearly 150 of the ship's survivors and reviewed some 800-odd documents related to the ship. It gained so much attention that he went on to testify about the disaster before Congress. And with the help of some of the ship's survivors, he rallied the public support necessary to prompt both Congress and the Navy to review the findings of their predecessors nearly 55 years earlier. Now, with that said, let's dig into the story of the Indianapolis. Let's explore the anatomy of a disaster and understand why it's worth discussing today. Now, to begin, I think it's important to build a little bit of context about the war in the Pacific and where things stood by July of 1945. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to be focusing almost exclusively on the broad actions and motivations of the Japanese and American militaries in that theater. For a variety of reasons, Japan became increasingly totalitarian politically and nationalistic socially. From the time that Emperor Hirohito assumed the throne in 1926, there was a growth in secret societies and nationalistic societies, both for youth as well as adults. The growth of these societies were spurred on by the leadership of the Imperial Army as well as the Imperial Navy, who in the decades leading up to World War II were vying for greater political control. The Army even had its own political party, which grew in such power and popularity that it was able to twice attempt a coup in the 1930s, with no meaningful action taken against either its leadership or its structure. Now, the leaders in the Army and Navy established these societies, both in military and civilian circles, to promote their own imperialist goals, often tying old traditions to modern European fascist ideals. This included concepts like the Bushido Code, the old moral code of the samurai, as well as samurai weapons like the katana began to appear on officers' hips. Ideas like these even trickled into religion, with the so-called New Shinto that tied the emperor, the people, the land, and morality as indivisible. This new state Shinto saw the emperor worshipped like a god, and many traditional priests imprisoned. To put it simply, the glory of Japan became the driving cultural force in the country. And in that pursuit, the empire sought to maintain and expand its sphere of influence into the Pacific as well as the Asian continent. But Japan is not a resource-rich land, at least not insofar as its imperialist goals were at the time. As the Depression set in, Japan needed more raw materials to grow its economy and empire. The Army and Navy were rival factions, each with their own vision of what an imperial Japan should look like politically as well as militarily. And so each sought to solve the resource problem in their own ways. The Army's plan was to invade mainland China and perhaps even Siberia, and use its peoples as a workforce to harvest the resources there. The Navy's plan was to go after European colonies in the Pacific as well as in Southeast Asia. The Navy's plan was to go after European colonies in the Pacific as well as Southeast Asia, and to replace them as the overlords there. Both of these plans would eventually come to pass, but the Army's plan was put into action first. A decade before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese began to expand their borders into mainland Asia with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Ostensibly, the invasion was launched to liberate the ethnic Manchus there from oppression by the Chinese, but in reality was little more than an excuse to exploit the land's natural resources so that the empire could continue its expansion efforts. Japan took Manchuria with little resistance and set up a puppet government, as it would go on to do across other Southeast Asian territories. But Japan invaded China proper in 1937 in what was known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. Now, at the time, the Republic of China was trying to pursue a policy of appeasement with Japan, as it was locked into a bloody civil war with communist elements within its own borders. When the Japanese invasion began, it essentially created a three-way conflict. Eventually, though, the communist and the nationalist formed an uneasy truce that would remain for the rest of the war. As the war in China unfolded, Europe and the United States watched Japan's expansionism very carefully. They did so especially when Japan joined the Tripartite Pact with Italy and Germany in 1938, forming what we know as the Axis powers. When the Germans swept over Western Europe, the Dutch, British, French, and Australians braced their colonies for attack, but initially saw none. Now this is where the Imperial Navy's plan came into place. Its commanders intended to sweep south with blitzkrieg speed into Indochina and the Pacific Islands. But as they drew up their war plans, they determined that America would be the biggest obstacle to that goal. For though the United States was still at this point a neutral party in the war, it was close allies with Britain and France with the Lend-Lease program, but also had the most considerable naval power between the three in the Pacific. Horrified by the images coming out of China, the United States placed an oil embargo on Japan in 1941, pending their unconditional withdrawal from China. Without a steady supply of oil, the empire's expansion would be dead in the water, and so they chose to deal an unexpected knockout blow to the United States. That blow came in December 7th of 1941, when 6 Japanese carriers launched bombers and torpedo planes against the naval base at Pearl Harbor. Their plan was to destroy as many naval assets as possible, and on that day they destroyed or otherwise incapacitated 18 ships, including 8 battleships. They also destroyed 188 planes and killed 2,400 servicemen and civilians. But what they had really hoped to hit that day was the Pacific Fleet's aircraft carriers that were due to arrive in Pearl on December 6. But alas, they were delayed by poor weather. Nevertheless, within hours of the attack at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Army and Navy launched simultaneous attacks against American forces in Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines, as well as British forces in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaya. They also invaded Thailand, turning into a puppet state within hours. Less than a month later, they invaded the Dutch East Indies, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, the islands of Bali, and Timor. Within 3 months, the Empire of Japan had swelled across East Asia and much of the Pacific. Their naval command knew that they would not be able to hold this territory unless the U.S. Navy was decisively defeated. And so Admiral Yamamoto massed carrier divisions at Midway Atoll, just 1,100 miles from Hawaii, and dared the Americans to meet him. By May of 1942, the Americans had regrouped and devised strategies to move forward. To keep the Japanese from advancing, their navy, particularly their carriers, had to be decisively destroyed. And so the Battle of Midway commenced on June 4th, and over the course of the next 3 days, 3 American carrier groups did battle with 4 Japanese carriers, which resulted in a U.S. victory, having lost one carrier while the Japanese lost all four, resulting in a total rout. However, the real turning point would come at Guadalcanal. The Japanese were determined to maintain a defensive perimeter in the Pacific, and they decided to make a stand, whatever the cost, on that island. The United States Navy massed on the island and landed Marines, resulting in vicious fighting both on the land as well as the sea. The fight went on for 6 grueling months until February of 1943, when the fight to hold the island just became too costly for the Japanese, and so they withdrew. This defeat would put Japan on the defensive for the rest of the war. The beginning of the end would come a year later when the United States took control of the Marianas Islands. This was significant because it effectively cut off the main Japanese convoy routes used to supply its island forces, and it gave the United States a strategic base to launch bombing campaigns against the Japanese mainland. It's here where the management of the U.S.'s Pacific forces would get political. The two main players were General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the United States Army Forces of the East, and Admiral Nimitz, commander-in-chief of the United States Pacific Fleet. MacArthur's island-hopping strategy would see the Army, which was of course reliant upon naval ships, retaking the Philippines before taking back other islands all the way along the Pacific coast. Nimitz saw this as a needless waste of life and resources, and so his strategy was to bypass the big islands and instead liberate Taiwan to launch an invasion of the Japanese mainland. President Roosevelt compromised by giving the men their own theaters of combat, but the resulting power struggle would go on to create communication problems, such that would sow the seeds for the fate of the Indianapolis. Now, the Indianapolis was actually of some celebrity, both before and during the war. Constructed in 1932, it was one of only 2 Portland-class heavy cruisers, the other being the aptly named USS Portland. These ships were longer and lighter than previous cruisers. As Doug Stanton put it in his 2001 book, In Harm's Way, a fantastic book about the USS Indianapolis, the ship weighed about as much as a 10-story office building. But with 107,000 horsepower, it had a top speed of 32.7 knots, or for the non-nautical amongst us, that's about 37.5 miles an hour. However, this speed did come with the cost of armor, as it had between 3 to 4 inches of steel on its midships, compared to the average 13 for a battleship, while its deck only had 2. From bow to rudder, it was nearly the size of 2 football fields at 610 feet. And from the waterline of her bone-white hull to the top of her antenna, she stood at nearly 133 feet tall. The Indianapolis was bigger and better armed than destroyers, which use sonar gear to hunt submarines and keep the waters safe for ships like the Indianapolis. As a cruiser, its purpose was to direct anti-aircraft fire at enemy planes attacking naval formations, as well as to shell enemy land positions during amphibious assaults. The Indianapolis carried 4 different kinds of guns. There were 9 of the 8-inchers on 3 turrets. Those were capable of lobbing 250-pound shells up to 18 miles. If all 9 barrels of the ship's 8-inch guns were fired simultaneously, the recoil could turn the ship over. There was actually an account of a sailor standing too close to one of these guns when it went off, and it ripped the shirt off of his back. Apparently it took weeks for his hearing to return. Next, there were the 5-inch guns, which shot barrages of flak that could take out both airplanes as well as gun emplacements or pillboxes up to 8 miles from shore. These were capable of shooting 500 rounds of ammunition in 6 minutes flat. The bigger of the guns could be operated by tracking devices called fire control directors, but could also be maneuvered by hand with a crew of about 20 men. Now, when it came to the layout of the ship, there were 4 bridges that stood about 45 feet above the deck, and underneath these bridges were what's called officer country, the quarters of the officers. Nearby this was Radio Shack 1, where men sat in a 10-foot room typing minute-by-minute messages from Pacific commands. Behind the second smokestack was Radio Room 2, which was normally unoccupied, but its transmitters were kept warmed up just in case the number 1 room got knocked out in an attack. The lower decks held 25 compartments where 1,100-odd crewmen bunked. These compartments were connected by narrow passageways, just big enough for two men to pass by one another while brushing shoulders, and the bunks were stacked quite literally from floor to ceiling. Moving aft, the ship had a mess hall complete with a ice cream stand, which was next to a post office. And walking past the post office, you would come to the dental office, as well as the sick bay. And even further was the library, which included a photo lab for developing photographs taken by the ship's recon planes. Yes, on deck, on either side of the ship, there were catapults to launch these planes. There were 2 engine rooms, located fore and aft one another, so that if one blew up, there would always be one in reserve. Also fore and aft one another were 100-foot observation towers that were connected by telephone to the bridge. Positioned strategically around the ship were stacks of life rafts, 4 high, along with floater nets. There was enough life-saving equipment aboard to handle 1,500 men. Life vests were stored in hanging bags tacked along the bulkhead running the length of the ship, and every man had one next to his bunk. In fact, on the day the Indianapolis set sail from San Francisco with the bomb, it was carrying nearly 2,500 life vests because of a clerical error that gave it a double order. So that's something of a bird's eye view of the ship's specifications. Now with that, let's take a look at the ship's record. I said before it was a ship of some celebrity. And that's because upon its construction in 1932, it was chosen by President Roosevelt to be his ship of state. It was from the Indianapolis that he would stand smoking a cigar as he reviewed America's naval fleet. It was also on the Indianapolis that he would travel to South America. In 1936, as war raged in Spain, China, and Ethiopia, the United States called for a meeting of the Pan-American nations to come together and discuss peaceful policies to settle differences, rather than to fall in the kind of bloodshed that was being seen across the other continents. This meeting of the nations was held in Buenos Aires, and President Roosevelt attended in person. While in South America, the Indianapolis next sailed to Rio de Janeiro, so that President Roosevelt could meet with the Brazilian president. And before its return to America, the ship engaged in war exercises off of the coast of Chile, becoming the flagship of the Navy's scouting fleet. It took about a decade after the ship was constructed before it finally saw action. By 1942, it was no longer a state-of-the-art ship. The newer cruiser classes that had been commissioned in the lead-up to World War II were better armed and better armored. Nevertheless, it was still a beloved ship. And so it won its first battle star during the Battle of the Coral Sea in 1942. And after seeing more action in the Aleutian Islands, it was made the flagship of the Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance for the next 2 years. Spruance served under Chester Nimitz, and the ship's fate would later be inexplicably tied to him. But it was while under Spruance that the Indy saw fierce fighting as it bombarded beaches, evaded submarines, and shot down Japanese aircraft in the New Guinea campaign and the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In early 1945, the ship was assigned to Task Force 94 for the invasion of Okinawa. While engaged in pre-invasion bombardment, it suffered a near-fatal kamikaze attack. A fighter managed to drop a bomb straight through the ship's decks before it exploded in the water underneath. The incident killed 9 men and wounded 24 others, not to mention badly damaging the ship's water condensers, which created the steam necessary to power the ship's 4 turbine engines. Nevertheless, on its own power, the ship was able to limp back to Mare Island in San Francisco for repairs. While the Indianapolis was undergoing repairs at Mare Island, the ship's captain, Charles Butler McVeigh, was called into a meeting in which he was informed the ship was to take aboard a secret project and depart early for an unknown location in the Pacific. Captain McVeigh was uneasy about doing this, as the ship was due for another 6 weeks' worth of repairs, and the ship's condensers were nowhere near operational capacity. Things were so bad that the men aboard were forbidden from using the drinking fountains, and were likewise showering with seawater. In addition to that, 250 of the crewmen, including 35 of the Indy's 80 officers, were brand new to the ship. Some of these men were less than 2 weeks out of boot camp. Nevertheless, on either July the 15th or 16th, there are conflicting accounts. The ship sailed 30 miles to Hunter's Point, and all hands were called on deck to await the loading of the secret cargo. As the men stood there, 2 trucks drove up the wharf, and 2 large items emerged from under their canvas flaps. The first was an enormous wooden crate. Some say it was about 5 feet high, 5 feet wide, and maybe 15 feet long. The second was a metal canister, painted jet black. They say it was about knee-high and maybe 18 inches wide. The Marines unloading the items struggled beneath their weight before they were loaded onto a crane and pulled up to an area of the port hangar, a place normally used for the observation plane's catapult. Along with the cargo came 2 Army Ordnance officers, Major Robert Furman and Captain James Nolan. They took their quarters in the flag lieutenant's quarters, who was evidently absent from the ship. Captain Nolan reported to McVeigh that with the help of the ship's welder, the canister had been fastened to the deck of his quarters, and that in the event of the ship sinking, both the canister and the crate should each be loaded onto their own lifeboat before the ship was evacuated. McVeigh, having no idea what was in these containers, tried fishing for information by stating he didn't think that they were going to use biological warfare in this war. But Captain Nolan played it cool and simply left the bridge without further explanation. Unbeknownst to anyone on board, Nolan was a radiologist, and Furman was an engineer involved with the Manhattan Project. They had been tasked with transporting the essential components of Little Boy, and half of the fissile uranium in the United States, an estimated value of some $300 million, or in 2021 money, $4.5 billion. It was their job to transport it from San Francisco to Tinian Island, where they would later help to assemble it. By all accounts, the 2 of them tried to stay away from the rest of the crew. Their uniforms were apparently ill-fitting, and they didn't seem to know much about Army ordnance. I'd also like to note at this point that the Indianapolis was actually not the first choice to carry the weapon. It was originally tasked to the USS Pensacola, which was another cruiser. However, a week before the components made their way to San Francisco, its engines quit in rough seas while completing sea trials, and so the job then fell to the Indianapolis. On July 16th, the ship began to sail out of the harbor. At the last minute, 100 extra men were loaded onto the ship, evidently needing to be taxied to Hawaii. Apart from that, though, Captain McVeigh didn't know where he was going to sail next. At 6:30 a.m., just as the Indy was leaving to begin its journey to Pearl Harbor, it was unexpectedly given an order to halt. Unknown to any of the men on board, there was an explosion 1,000 miles away in a scrubby expanse of the New Mexico desert. In an enormous flash, the desert sands were turned to glass, and a 100-foot tower of smoke and debris went skyward. This would go on to be known as the Trinity Test, the first ever detonation of an atomic weapon. Had the test failed, the Indianapolis would have been recalled back to harbor, but because it succeeded, a new order was given by motorboat, one which read, "Indianapolis, under orders of Commander-in-Chief, must not be diverted from its mission for any reason." Unaccompanied, the ship set sail for Hawaii, and at a specified distance, Captain McVeigh opened his sealed orders and announced to the crew that they would be on a speed run to the island of Tinian. At an earlier meeting, he told his officers that he did not know what the cargo was, but that he had been told that every day they got closer would be another day off the war. At a breakneck speed, the Indianapolis made its voyage in 74 and a half hours, a record that as of 2001 had not been broken. I have tried to find evidence as to whether or not this is still the record, but as of yet have been unable to find anything to either corroborate or deny this claim. If you should happen to know what the record is from San Francisco to Hawaii, please chime in on social media and let us know, because I would love to know the answer to that. After unloading the sailors at Pearl, it broke for Tinian, arriving there a week later on Thursday, July 26. The Indianapolis had actually been here before, when it helped the Fifth Fleet to level the island before an amphibious invasion in July of 1944. This time, there was hardly a bush or tree left on the island, and littered around the airfield were the hulks of B-29s that had been unable to get airborne and had instead exploded into showers of flames. But at this point in the war, it was considered to be a backwater, merely a place for bombers to take off on the runs to Japan. As the cargo was being unloaded, Nolan and Furman searched the crowd for a familiar face. Once they found one, they were told of the success of Trinity and quickly accompanied the components to begin assembling. With their mission completed, the crew of the Indianapolis immediately set sail 120 miles south to Guam, arriving the next day to receive the routing orders that would take them to the Fifth Fleet. Guam, like Tinian, was considered to be a backwater in the Pacific theater. It was positioned about 1,400 miles away from Okinawa. Also, like Tinian, it was heavily damaged from the intense bombardment and fighting to retake it the year prior. It was now an island teeming with 500,000 military personnel, serving both as a way station for passing transports and a dry dock for damaged ships. It was also a relay point for orders coming from Sank HQ, that is the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet headquarters, but more on that in a moment. That morning, Captain McVeigh met with members of Admiral Nimitz' support staff to inquire about gunnery training. With his extra crew and cargo unloaded, he was eager to resume training exercises and to bring his new crewmates up to speed with how the ship ran. However, he was disappointed to learn that Guam no longer offered gunnery training, and instead the ship would have to train at its next destination, Leyte, a command center in the Philippines. The Indianapolis was to follow the Petty convoy route, a 1,300-mile journey that had been used for the past 3.5 years. By all accounts, the route was considered routine and safe. Routing officers informed McVeigh that if the Indy left that night, Saturday, July 28th, they could arrive in Leyte by Monday the 30th, assuming a speed of 25 knots or about 29 miles per hour. However, McVeigh was concerned about how they had pushed the ship's engines in its breakneck race to Tinian, and he didn't want to put any unnecessary strain on them. So instead it was decided that they would travel at the slower speed of 15.7 knots and arrive Tuesday morning. Before we continue, I think it's important to discuss the state of the military's communications in the Pacific at this point in the war. Speaking broadly, directives were issued by Sank, stationed in Pearl Harbor. And from there, the coded messages would be sent out, ready to be received by radio officers, who remained on alert day and night at various relay stations across the ocean. These officers would code the messages and transmit them further down the line to their intended recipients. This method was obviously not foolproof, as human error could easily result in an officer mishearing or otherwise failing to decode a message properly before passing it along. While imperfect, this simply was the technology at the time. Now, as I mentioned before, there was something of a power struggle ensuing between the theater's lead commanders, General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz. In addition to MacArthur's command of the Pacific Army forces, he also had command of the Navy's 17th Fleet. MacArthur wanted to merge the fleet with the Army to give him better control over executing his island-hopping strategy. Nimitz, however, wanted the fleet to remain autonomous, creating political friction amongst the ranks that affected everything from the movement of ships to the relaying of messages. And it was that latter aspect that would go on to hinder the Indianapolis directly. According to the planned itinerary, the Indy was to sail the 1,300 miles along the Petty route to Leyte, making its journey in just under 3 days. While at Leyte, McVeigh would report to Rear Admiral Lynd McCormick for 17 days of repairs and training, before traveling north to Okinawa to join up with Task Force 95 for the invasion of Japan, anticipated later that autumn. While at Leyte, McVeigh would report to Rear Admiral Lynd McCormick, where he would engage in 17 days of repairs and training. Next, he would travel north to Okinawa, where the ship would join up with Task Force 95 for the invasion of Japan that was anticipated to come later that autumn. Now, 8 copies of this order was sent out by Sank. However, McCormick's staff did not properly decode the message. His radio man decoded the addressee of the message incorrectly, and so he never decoded the body of the message. Those that did receive the message were told of the Indianapolis's route, but not when it was to arrive. That was shared in a second message. That second message went out just before the Indianapolis disembarked from Guam, and was properly received by Admiral McCormick's staff. However, since he did not receive the first message, he did not know why the ship was reporting to him. As the famous flagship of the Fifth Fleet, he assumed that the Indianapolis would be redirected once it made it to Leyte and divert course, likely without ever making landfall. Its arrival, therefore, was a non-issue to him. Meanwhile, in Okinawa, Admiral Oldendorf had received the first message stating that the Indianapolis would stop in Leyte before traveling north to report to him. However, he didn't receive the second message, giving the date when it was to arrive. As Doug Stanton puts it, the effect of this double error was simple. The two people to whom McVeigh was to report did not have enough information to know whether or not he was late. It was now McVeigh's turn to receive insufficient information. As a cruiser, the Indianapolis had no sonar, no depth charges, or any other gear relevant to submarine warfare. When such ships made long voyages, they were always accompanied by destroyers to protect against any surprise undersea attacks. When McVeigh was given his routing orders, he naturally requested a destroyer escort, but was turned down because he was informed that no escort would be necessary. Incredulous, he requested the latest intelligence report of the region. The report stated that recently there had been 3 sightings of submarines, but 2 of these 3 sightings were unconfirmed to be enemy subs. As a result, he was recommended simply to sail in a zigzag pattern during the day and use his discretion by night. However, this report failed to mention 2 vital pieces of information. The first was that 3 days earlier, the destroyer USS Underhill had been sunk by a chitin suicide torpedo, resulting in the deaths of 112 men. The second was intel deduced by Ultra, the extremely top-secret code-breaking program used by the Allies to decode Axis messages. The United States had 2 heavily guarded centers for Ultra decryption, one in Pearl Harbor, the other in Washington, D.C. The program's existence was so top secret it wasn't even acknowledged until the 1970s. During the war in the Pacific, the program had been a vital part of tracking the movement and missions of Japanese vessels. It had been used by the Americans to annihilate Japanese forces during the Battle of Midway. However, several days after the battle, American newspapers reported that the battle's success was due in large part because the military had learned ahead of time where the ships would be located. The effect was disastrous. Within a week, the Japanese changed their entire encrypting system, leaving the codebreakers to work tirelessly to learn their new system. As a result of this, the program's existence needed to be protected at all costs. And so the decision was made that certain troops and ships would not be reported or attacked to avoid drawing Japanese suspicion. At the time the Indianapolis was due to set sail, Ultra was tracking Japanese submarines from the Taimon Group that were operating along the Petty Route. Captain Oliver Naquin, who was the commanding officer of the Marianas Command, knew both of the Underhill's sinking and of the Taimon Group's activity in the area. For whatever reason, he never fully explained why he did not share even a portion of this information with McVeigh. And documents related to the submarine's activity were not made public until the 1980s. If you go online, you can read these documents, and I must say they are staggering. Not only was Ultra aware of the submarine's positions and movements more than a week before the Indianapolis even set sail with the bomb, but it was also discovered that one of them had sunk a ship that would turn out to be the Indianapolis, and none of this information was ever passed along. And so it was that on the night of Saturday, July 28th, McVeigh left Guam uninformed and unexpected. As the sun began to dip below the horizon that evening, the Indianapolis crossed into a portion of the Pacific known as Challenger's Deep. It is the deepest part of the Marianas Trench. You could drop Mount Everest to the bottom of its floor and there would still be another mile of ocean above it. It's also 300 miles from the nearest island. Sometime between 7:30 and 8 p.m., Captain McVeigh gave the order to quit zigzagging. Once again, this was something he was told he could do at his discretion during times of poor visibility. And by all accounts, that night was cloudy, the water was choppy, and there was only a crescent moon in the sky. Now, air conditioning was not a luxury the Indianapolis enjoyed. All day, it would absorb heat, leaving the inside of the ship with an average of 95 degrees during the day and 120 if you were in the engine rooms. The crew quarters would still be pretty hot at night, and as a result, many of them regularly chose to sleep on deck. That night, Captain McVeigh ordered the ship to the yoke-modified condition, in which all hatches and doors were left open to let that heat out. Now, this is not the most secure form of travel. That is condition Z, in which all doors and hatches would be closed, so that the compartments would be impenetrable to water. In yoke-modified, these watertight compartments could be breached within seconds. But McVeigh did this believing his intelligence report, which told him that his route was clear. And so that night, when everyone bedded down, there were about 300 men sleeping on deck. 12 miles from where the Indianapolis cruised, Lieutenant Commander Machisura Hashimoto was awakened for night maneuvers. Hashimoto was the commander of Submarine I58. The ship was 356 feet long, carried a seaplane, and could cruise 21,000 miles before refueling. In addition to its 19 torpedoes, it also had 6 chitin suicide torpedoes. Chitins looked like miniature submarines. They were 46 feet long, had a range of 27 miles, and could travel at a speed of 20 knots. Once a chitin was fired, there was no recovering it. There was no escape for its pilot. They would simply drift into the darkening water until they reached crush depth. At this point in the war, Hashimoto had failed to sink a single ship, and his impression was that Japan's defeat was imminent. So zealous was he that he built a Shinto shrine and prayed to it daily that he might sink something. At 11 p.m. that evening, he ordered the crew to their night action stations. Just a few minutes later, a petty officer informed him that he could hear dishes clinking about 12.5 miles away. As he began to creep towards the Indy, he ordered 6 torpedo compartments loaded with a chitin on standby. This was a tense time because every minute that passed by would give greater distance, thereby altering his firing plan. But he kept on, creeping towards the ship at about 3 knots. As I-58 approached the Indianapolis, Hashimoto studied a book of American silhouettes. At first he was worried that it was a destroyer hunting for them, but after repositioning, he saw the Indianapolis for what it was. At 12:04 a.m., the submarine positioned itself and fired its first torpedo. These torpedoes had magnetic heads. They carried 1,200 pounds of explosives, enough to wipe out a city block. It also traveled much faster than any ship at 48 knots. Hashimoto launched 6 of these in a widening fan at 3-second intervals. In less than a minute, 2 of them made contact with the Indy. The first torpedo hit the forward starboard side, that is the right side for the non-nautical amongst us, and blew 65 feet of the bow skyward. Men were thrown as many as 15 feet into the air. The second one hit at midship. It hit the gas tank containing more than 3,500 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. This fuel incinerated everything in its path, and according to survivors, the first chimney looked like a volcano spewing out several hundred feet of fire into the air and all over the deck. That second torpedo had also pierced the 4 inches of steel below the bridge in what was known as officers' country, blowing apart the first engine room, as well as the powder magazine for the 8-inch guns. The explosion was so great from the torpedoes, it actually whipped the ship onto a new course entirely. The engines kept the ship moving at about 17 knots, and with the bow gone, it drank in seawater by the ton. By 12:06 a.m., the ship was nearly in half. Everything forward of the first smokestack was struggling for life, while everything aft was nearly untouched. However, within minutes, flames were whipping through those compartments as the ship began to list. All communications and electrical power were dead. It was impossible to talk to the engine rooms. This was critical, as they needed to be shut off in order to stop the flow of water. The engineers tried in vain to contact the bridge, but to no avail. Believing themselves to be torpedoed and therefore still in danger of yet more torpedoes, they made the decision to keep the engines running to try to evade the enemy's submarine. Meanwhile, Captain McVeigh had been thrown out of bed and immediately knew that he had 3 pressing jobs. He had to assess the damage, take care of it, and engage the enemy. He stumbled to the bridge naked through the darkness, a darkness so thick that the men there couldn't even make one another out. He immediately ordered a man to Radio Shack 1 to send out a distress signal with their longitude and latitude repeatedly. That man, Commander John Janey, would never be seen again. Because he was unable to get in contact with any other part of the ship, he thought that the Indy could still be saved. He immediately got clothed and was met by a gunnery officer. At this point, nobody knew whether they had been bombed or torpedoed or shelled by a Japanese battleship, but McVeigh correctly guessed that they had been torpedoed. He quickly made his way back to his cabin and got dressed. Upon his return, he got his first indication of the terrible magnitude of the damage when he met a gunnery officer with no hands and no eyes. You check your watch again. It's 11:59 p.m. Leaning against the bulkhead in the boiler room, you're antsy for the next guy to relieve you from fire watch. It's been hours since the boiler has needed to be lit, and the stifling hot air down here is setting you on edge. You eye a figure coming down the corridor and recognize it straight off as the midnight shift. Right on time. You and the figure exchange grunts that pass for salutations as you sneak around one another in the cramped hallway. You work your way through the labyrinth of tight passageways heading aft to find your quarters. Once you get there, you make your way through the darkness by memory to your bunk and grab your bedding. The boiler room may be as hot as hell's hinges, but the bunks aren't much better. Even at midnight, the temperatures here are somewhere in the 80s after the ship has spent all day soaking up the sun's equatorial heat. Because of this, a lot of guys choose to sleep on the ship's deck, hard as it might be. You plan on being one of those guys right now. You check your watch again and put a little more pep in your step. It's 12:04 a.m. now, and dawn calisthenics are only hours away. Just as you turn to climb the last set of stairs leading topside, an explosion rips through the ship, spilling you to the floor. Stunned, your arms flail out trying to grab hold of something so you can pull yourself up when it happens again. The ship shakes violently and roars, resounding with intensity through the hallways the sound of smaller but still very large explosions. In the daze of your ringing ears and starstruck vision, nothing makes sense. Until suddenly, with sober and horrifying clarity, it does. You are attacked. You're being attacked right now. Were those bombs or torpedoes? It doesn't matter. You have to get to your battle station. You have to get topside. You leap up the stairwell and thrust yourself on deck when you're stopped dead in your tracks by the terrible magnitude of the damage. There's fire everywhere you look. It's pouring out of seams in the splintered deck and appears to be raining down from the sky. Slowly you walk out a little ways and look up behind you. The number 1 smokestack is billowing out fire and sending it flying through the night, like some great and terrible volcano. The smaller explosions make sense now. It's the ordnance and fuel exploding in their storerooms below you. Water. Dear God, we've got to get water on this right now. By the light of the crimson glows around you, you get your bearings and make your way through the acrid, smoke-ridden air to the nearest water hose. There's a sailor standing nearby, naked, save for his skivvies, standing in slack-jawed horror at the carnage around him. Hey, we've got to get some water on that. Barely able to hear yourself through the ringing in your ears. You turn and begin to unwrap the hose on the wall as your shipmate slowly walks to the plug. You get as close as you can to a patch of burning flames pouring from the shattered deck. Brace yourself and yell, "Throw it!" Seconds go by and nothing happens. You whip around and yell again, "Throw it!" "It's all the way," the boy cries back. Damn, no water pressure. It must have knocked out the pumps. It's then that you notice you're leaning. In fact, everything's leaning starboard. The ship is listing maybe as much as 15 degrees. You drop the hose and begin to head forward. There's no water pressure, and there's probably no power since no one is giving orders over the PA. You decide you need to get to the bridge. You need to know what's going on, and you need to hear it from officers directly. You shuffle and push your way through the throngs of men on deck. You barely notice the ones pulling their buddies so badly firm they barely look human anymore, past you in the direction of sickbay. As you near the bridge, there's a cacophony of movement and voices. Crewmen with knives are hacking and slashing life rafts and floater nets off the wall while officers are yelling not to jump without a life jacket. We're abandoning ship. The list is significant now, and you fight to stay on your feet as men and equipment begin to slide down the deck. You get to the wall and feel around until you find a life jacket. Thank God the ship got a double order of them back in port. You pull it on and brace yourself as men go spilling past you into the sea. If you don't jump soon, you're going to fall like they did. You scan the water but can barely see anything in the darkness. If you fall wrong, you'll land on a guy's head, maybe killing both of you in the process. There's a sudden crash down the deck and you see a guy screaming, pinned by one of the whale boats. It's now or never. You push up the wall and fly screaming all the way down into the darkness. You plunge, still screaming, into a black ocean. The taste of salt water and something else fills your mouth and windpipe, and you kick wildly trying to get back to the surface. After what feels like an eternity, you break back through the water, gagging, throwing up all the water you suck down. As your stomach begins to settle, you feel your skin starting to burn. You pull your hands up and begin to wipe away at your face, realizing in the process you're covered in oil. It's thick as molasses and you're probably floating right in the middle of a slake. Through stinging eyes, you try to scan the horizon. Through cloudy skies, the crescent moon shows you very little. There's no ship, not anymore. There are only the disembodied eyes groaning in the darkness, calling out in terror and anguish. You look at the water below you. It is black. You look at the sky above you. It is black. Here, where time has stopped, you think of that place that Father Conway speaks of so solemnly and so grimly. That place where there is only darkness and the weeping and gnashing of teeth. You are there now. For how long, you wonder? What now? On bridge, Captain McVeigh wasn't sure why things were going so bad so quickly. And he was worried about abandoning the ship prematurely, because if he did so while it was salvageable, he could be court-martialed. Eventually, though, his second-in-command, Joseph Flynn, told him that the Indianapolis was hopelessly flooded and suggested abandoning ship. McVeigh deferred to his judgment and gave the order just 8 minutes after the torpedoes struck. With its bow gone, the remaining 150 feet of deck was threatening to blow off against the sheer force of the oncoming water, and it began to groan as machinery and other equipment began to give way in the compartments below deck. Since there was no PA, Captain McVeigh had to shout at the men below deck to abandon ship, which they did post-haste. Amazingly, the ship's bugler thought that he personally was being commanded to abandon the ship, which he did without sounding the bugle, just leading to more confusion. Now, in theory, abandoning the ship was supposed to be an orderly affair, in which life rafts and motorboats would be dropped down into the water with rope ladders lowered so that men could board. Each raft could hold about 22 men, and was outfitted with survival gear such as first aid kits, signaling devices, as well as food provisions and beakers of fresh water. By contrast, there was no order on the Indianapolis that night, just chaos. In boot camp, the men had been told to jump off the high side of the ship. Just below the bridge, there were about 400 men crowding the rail. A lieutenant who hadn't heard the order to abandon ship was shouting for the men not to jump, though they ignored him and leapt the 80 feet down into the water. These men were jumping on the port side or left side. Of the 35 life rafts, only 12 made it off, and of these, very few of them carried the specified provisions. Some were so inadequately prepared that their water kegs had not even been filled. Compounding this problem was that many of the survival chests had not been loaded. These chests included useful items like common hand tools, sails, fishing kits. Fortunately, though, the ship's one saving grace was that it did have that overabundance of life vests. McVeigh didn't know if any of the distress messages had gotten off, and was debating going down to Radio Shack 1 himself, but the ship suddenly rolled 90 degrees, and he realized getting there would be impossible. Unbeknownst to him, Radio Shack 1 was in fact knocked out by the second torpedo, but Radio Shack 2 had remained up and running. The men there had managed to improvise a transmitter out of equipment normally used to receive messages, and for 2 minutes straight, they transmitted the ship's coordinates and SOS. In the chaos, men reacted in different ways to the ship's sinking. There are a few accounts of guys going to the mess hall, quickly making sandwiches or grabbing hold of canned food, while others quickly jotted letters home. Up on the signal bridge, a few men stuffed classified documents into a bag, which they intended to sink to keep it from falling into enemy hands. But as the ship's tilt grew more pronounced, they gave up and stuffed it under a desk. On deck, men with knives were desperately hacking at the bags of life vests and floater nets. As the ship rolled, one man was apparently crushed when he cut free a lifeboat, which went on to pin him before sliding into the ship's bulkhead. Wherever they were, men grabbed as much as they could before jumping over. Now those that had jumped to port jumped into a sea that was nearly devoid of life-saving equipment. Because the ship was listing starboard, most of the gear had slid in that direction. But regardless of the side they jumped from, they were all swimming through a poisonous field of oil, thick as molasses. Some of them swallowed it, causing them to vomit violently. It smothered them, with the acidity eating away at their sensitive skin in every orifice. As the ship began its final plunge, Captain McVeigh was in crisis. He briefly debated the merits of going down with the ship before determining that he was responsible for the survival of his men. As he prepared to jump, a wave suddenly washed him off deck. For some time afterwards, he swam through the oily ocean and tried to turn around to get his bearings, but when he did, he saw that the ship was gone. He could see nothing at all in the darkness. It is estimated that about 300 men died during the torpedoing and subsequent explosions. In total, the ship had managed to plow on for about 2 miles before finally raising its stern skyward and slipping under the ocean. Some of the men reported that they could see light through the portholes of the ship as it slowly fell to the ocean floor, until the pressure eventually became so great that the air in the remaining chambers exploded in a giant whoomph. In all, it had taken the Indianapolis only 12 minutes to sink. Meanwhile, 650 miles to the west, off the island of Leyte, the Indianapolis's intended destination, at least 3 radio men received the distress signal, which included the ship's coordinates. The first was radioman Claire Young, who received it and immediately brought it over to the sleeping quarter of the naval base's ranking commander, Commodore Jacob Jacobson. Young woke Jacobson up and read him the message, and quickly asked him if he had a reply. Jacobson responded that he had no reply at that time, but if further messages were received, that he was to be notified at once. I have seen it alleged, though I have not seen anything to corroborate, that Jacobson was drunk that evening. Regardless, a very confused Young returned to his post. In the days that followed, Young would notice the Indianapolis's empty berth in the harbor and wonder if any of the base's commanders had followed up with the SOS message. The second radio man to receive the message was Donald Allen. He was the jeep driver for Commodore Norman Gillette, commander of the Philippine Sea Frontier. At the time, Gillette was busy playing bridge, and so Allen reported the ship's coordinates to another officer, who immediately dispatched 2 tugboats in their direction. However, the next morning, upon hearing that the tugs had been dispatched without his authority, Gillette recalled them back to Leyte. In all, they had completed 7 hours of what would have been a 21-hour cruise. And yet a third message was received aboard a landing craft in the harbor. Its crew attempted in vain to follow up with the Indy, and when no response was received, the message was passed through channels up the chain of command, but no one followed up to verify the authenticity of the message. Now, if you are perplexed as to why the naval commanders at Leyte wouldn't have moved heaven and earth to follow up on 3 reports of a ship having been torpedoed, the answer lies in prevailing naval protocol at the time. You see, early in the war, any such message like that would have been followed up with immediately. And the Japanese knew this, and they would often send out bogus sinking reports, sometimes to confuse and sometimes to ambush would-be rescue vessels. As such, Naval Command directed that any distress signals that couldn't be confirmed with a reply were to be disregarded as pranks. And so it was that the 900 survivors now in the water were not missed and were not being looked for. For these men, surviving the ship's sinking was only the beginning of their ordeal. Due to the incredible speed at which the ship sank, many of the men in the water floated in the open ocean without so much as a life vest to hang on to. Keep in mind that in the time you spent listening to this, the USS Indianapolis would have sunk 5 times over. Out here, lost at sea and with no land for hundreds of miles, the surviving men of the USS Indianapolis found themselves utterly alone. Facing exposure, dehydration, hypothermia, starvation, it would be days before any hope of rescue came. And tragically, they were not as alone as they thought. Because in the open ocean, there's more than exposure that can kill you. There were, of course, the sharks to worry about. I'd like to thank you for listening to the first episode of Grisly History. We'll be finishing the story of the USS Indianapolis in the next episode, but I can tell you already there was quite a bit that we left out of these episodes for the sake of brevity. I'd like to dive deeper into this story, to explore some of the details that we didn't include as well as eyewitness accounts. I'd also like to spend some time answering any questions and clarifying any information we've covered so far. If you would be interested in that sort of thing, please let us know. If there's significant interest, I'd love to release bonus content and interviews to ensure we've covered all sides of the story. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard thus far, please consider following the show wherever you get your podcast, interacting with us on social media, and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Remember, your early support now will help us to shape Grisly History into what it becomes. Grisly History is hosted by myself, Graham Parker, and produced by Michael Ruiz. For more information on the show, as well as links to our various platforms, please visit our website, grizzlyhistory.com. And should you need a voiceover talent, I am available and would love to get in touch with you. Please reach out to my email address, graham@grizzlyhistory.com, and I'd be happy to talk to you about your upcoming project. Again, that is graham@grizzlyhistory.com. Thank you again, and please stay tuned, as Michael and I are very excited to bring you part 2 of Anatomy of a Disaster, Lost at Sea.